to Silicon Valley Buzz, a program where we discuss happenings here, the most fertile spot on the planet for new ideas. And I'm your host, Seth Shostak. Tonight, high-speed rail Redux, a project that's designed to bring superior passenger rail service between Los Angeles and San Francisco, is in trouble. Costs are up, expectations are down, so should we continue to build this railroad? Well, we'll be talking tonight with a guest who believes that the answer to that is yes. So please welcome Ben Tripousis. Did I get it right?
Tripousis.
Tripousis. Well, I didn't get it right. Okay. Ben is the Northern Regional Director of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. A bit of history, Ben. Voters approved in 2008 Proposition 1A, authorizing bonds to the tune of nearly $10 billion to build a high-speed rail line from San Francisco to Los Angeles. What's the status of the project now? Is there track in place? Is there even roadbed in place?
In fact, we are under construction in the Central Valley. The first 29 miles of the high-speed rail project from Madera to Fresno is underway. The project section from the city of Merced to Bakersfield is fully environmentally cleared and underway. And in fact, I'd counter your opening, Seth. The reality is that expectations are up and costs are in fact down. We are working very hard to ensure that we're reducing the overall cost of the project, and the first construction section that we're currently embarking on, in fact, came in, those construction contracts, the bids for those contracts came in at almost $100 million under the engineer's estimate. So we're well underway.
Well, let's address those costs, because I think originally the project was estimated to be, I think, $16 billion. That was back in 1996. So that's almost 2 decades ago, right? And it's gone up, and some people, I saw numbers over $100 billion to complete the project. If somebody asks you, what's this going to cost the state of California, or rather the citizens of the U.S., because it isn't all state monies, what's your answer?
The adjusted cost of the high-speed rail project, the full 800-mile project, is $67.4 billion. The actual costs are just over $50 billion, but if you adjust for a year of expenditure, which takes us out to when the project will be fully constructed, it's $67.4 billion. And we're fully committed to keeping on time and on budget toward that end. And in fact, we're able to make that much more accurate evaluation of the cost because we've completed a much more accurate evaluation of the engineering and what the project will really look like in all of the various communities up and down the state.
Now, one of the criticisms I hear about the HSR, high-speed rail, is that it's going to get out of the Central Valley at the bottom end by going a little bit to the east up to Tehachapi Pass, which adds something like 40 miles, I don't know what it is. It adds a significant number of miles to the line rather than just, I don't know, tunneling under the Grapevine, going the direct route to LA.
Well, some of those routes through the Tehachapis are currently being evaluated as part of our environmental clearance for that project section. The local communities like Santa Clarita and others through in and around the Tehachapis and through that project section are all weighing in on the various project alternatives, and we're looking to have a locally preferred alternative emerge out of those conversations. Having said that, going through communities like Palmdale and into the San Fernando Valley and connecting to Burbank most effectively is really about connecting to future riders and expanding mobility for that part of California.
So you're going to pick up enough riders to make it worth the trade-off in time? Because it'll obviously takes time to go an extra 40 miles.
Absolutely, and it really is more than about just the time it takes to get through there. It really is about connecting parts of California that have been disconnected from the economic centers, both north and south, and that includes the Central Valley communities of Merced and Fresno and Bakersfield, communities that have really been cut off from the opportunities that Northern California and Southern California have enjoyed for many years. If Central California were a state, it would be the 12th largest state in the country. It would also be the poorest and have among the worst air quality in the nation. Clearly, there are impacts that need to be addressed, and mobility and the opportunity for greater mobility is part of that equation, and we believe that high-speed rail can offer that for the Central Valley and really make them a much more effective, offer them a much more effective connection to the rest of California.
What about places like, well, I'm thinking of Modesto. I happened to be in Modesto not terribly long ago, and it just struck me, if I wanted to go anywhere from Modesto, I had to get in my car, really. Yeah. There was no alternative. some people say that the thing to do with the high-speed rail is just to run it down I-5, but if you do that, then you don't connect up with so many of these cities.
That's exactly right.
So why are people suggesting that? Do they think, well, it minimizes the environmental impact because you have the highway and the rail right next to one another?
Well, because too often we focus on the trip between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And yes, we do want to expedite that trip. And if you look at high-speed rail anywhere in the world, 800 miles and that initial 520-mile section that connects San Francisco to Los Angeles are really about the distances that high-speed rail proves to be most effective as a travel choice. We have amongst the most congested short-haul airline corridors in the country. We're looking to alleviate some of that, and in parts of the world where high-speed rail has come to the fore, airline trips have been greatly reduced. Most of those folks are getting off of planes and onto trains. We've certainly seen that in the Northeast corridor with the Acela, where trips from New York to Washington and Boston have really become train trips that used to be airline trips and made that travel much more effective. But we really want to expand that opportunity to California, and it's important that it is city-to-city travel. I had the opportunity to be at the San Jose State, Fresno State football game last season at the end of the college football season last year, and there were 9,000 Fresno State Bulldog fans in Spartan Stadium. Happily, the Spartans won, one of my alma maters, but those Fresno State fans then had a 3-hour trip back to Fresno. If our system was in place at that time, they'd be on a train and home in an hour. So it's about creating those opportunities, those travel opportunities that Californians don't currently enjoy.
I just want to pick up on one thing you've been saying here, 800-mile system. And anybody who's driven from here to LA knows it isn't 800 miles. So what are the endpoints of the system that make it 800 miles?
The endpoints are the city of Sacramento, where you'll go through Modesto and Stockton and that portion of the Central Valley and pick up those riders. Right now there's only 2 train trips out of Sacramento every day through the Central Valley. And finally extend to San Diego, which between Los Angeles and San Diego, the Low Sand Corridor, is amongst the most populated portion of the state.
Can you actually get the railroad down to San Diego and all these mountains in the way?
We're actually going, while we haven't selected a specific corridor, we're looking at possible corridors down either I-15 or 215 and extending out to San Bernardino and then heading south to San Diego.
I think maybe to give people an idea of what it would be like. You know, it's one thing to talk about high-speed rail, and people may think of the Northeast Corridor in the United States between Washington, New York, and Boston, or maybe they think of the bullet train in Japan or the fast trains in Europe. There's a little bit of video showing how this works, isn't there? And
there is.
I was hoping maybe we'd be able to run that video, and you could just tell us what we're looking at here. This is based, is this a recent?
This actually is an animation of what the high-speed system will look like in California. The depiction of the train, and there's the alignment extending from the Bay Area to Southern California. That initial phase extends to from LA Union Station to the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco, as it shows here, through Burbank. This was the section through the Tehachapi's we were talking about, coming out of Palmdale, heading north through the Central Valley, catching all those Central Valley communities, providing a very comfortable trip for travelers. Through the Central Valley, the trains will be operating at 220 miles an hour. In the urban areas, it will operate at anywhere between 110 and 150 miles an hour. But to come into the Bay Area, as you see, you come into Gilroy and then ultimately into the Diridon Station in San Jose. An important focal point of the station areas is that it gives us an opportunity for the stations to serve as a catalyst for development in and around the stations. And here you see the Transbay Terminal in downtown San Francisco, which is already under construction. It can be considered one of the first high-speed rail projects in California. And again, the kinds of densities that are created by having high-speed rail give you the opportunity to really look at development and the development footprint in and around the station locations. But again, it's about connecting the major centers of California, including the Central Valley, and really providing a level of mobility that California doesn't currently enjoy.
We don't have rail like this anywhere else in the U.S. yet.
No, we don't. The Acela system, as I mentioned, in the Northeast Corridor is the closest thing we have to this. There's also a private system under consideration, the Express West, that is looking to extend from roughly Palmdale in Southern California to Las Vegas. And right now there are 15 to 19 million people that travel the I-15 corridor out to Las Vegas every year. There's clearly a pent-up demand, a market for travelers between Southern California and Vegas, and we look for effective ways to connect our future high-speed system to that Express West system as well.
I think they ought to buy a round-trip ticket from LA just to make sure they can get back on in Las Vegas.
Exactly.
Well, all right. Look, this looks good to me. I've lived in places that's had better rail service than we enjoy here in the U.S. So the opposition, what is the opposition to high-speed rail? There have been repeated efforts to, as it were, derail it, and now to even litigate against the authority. What's really going on here?
Well, there are folks who have significant concerns about the potential impacts of high-speed rail. High-speed rail in the abstract is extremely popular. High-speed rail in your backyard has some challenges, and when you get to that ground level, there are serious concerns that need to be addressed, and we're working very hard with local communities to address those concerns. And that's part of my role as the regional director, is to work with local communities and local stakeholders to ensure that we're building a system that is in fact an asset and not an eyesore. It's a system that's fully integrated into the local communities in a way that those communities really would look to have transportation infrastructure incorporated into their community.
So wouldn't it be the case that if you bypass these communities, I mean, think of Palo Alto. If you say, well, we're just not going to run high-speed rail through Palo Alto, I don't know how you could avoid it, but let's say you did. Wouldn't they, 5 years later, be saying, we want to be on that line?
Almost always, if you look at any system in the world, that's generally how it goes. Once the infrastructure is in place and it's operating effectively, there are attempts to expand it. Japan is probably the best example of that. The initial line from Tokyo to Osaka created a spectacular system that is now celebrating its 50th year, and it's continued to grow over time, adding more cities to that system. That's what we hope to accomplish here in California.
Well, let's take some specifics, because I mentioned Palo Alto, and I believe that they are objecting and say, we don't want these high-speed trains going through our town. And say, and if you're going to do it, you're going to have to put it in a tunnel. But putting it in a tunnel is expensive. Atherton, they don't want it. They say they wouldn't use it, whatever. What's your response to these guys?
Well, in fact, we've addressed those concerns by moving to what is commonly referred to as a blended system, that we will now be operating high-speed trains on the Caltrain corridor, on the Caltrain right-of-way, the existing right-of-way. So it's not a fully built-out system that the peninsula initially had concerns with. So we're working with our partners at the Caltrain Joint Powers Board. Caltrain is moving forward with the electrification of the Caltrain commuter system, and we're partnering with them to develop a follow-on high-speed system where we will have eventually 6 commuter trains per hour per direction, and ultimately 4 high-speed trains per hour per direction operating between San Francisco and Gilroy.
But we have to increase the number of, now it's a double-track line up to the city. Will you have to have, with a couple of passing tracks, I think, but will you have to build more tracks? Will it be a 4-track line, or will it stay 2-track?
No, it will stay primarily 2 tracks. We will be looking at potential passing track locations. We are also going to look at grade separations up and down the peninsula to make the corridor safer, and then look at station modifications that we need to make at the stations where we'll both be stopping, at Millbrae, at San Jose Diridon, at the Transbay Terminal in San Francisco. So there are modifications that will follow the electrification of Caltrain, but it will be, as I say, primarily within those 2 tracks.
All right. When I listen to talk radio, and I have to confess that I do, I often hear people inveighing against this project. And it's also the case, Jerry Brown, he defends it, and he usually gets beaten up for defending it. But there have been a number of Democrats, for example, who originally supported it in 2012, who turned against it. Gavin Newsom, Joe Smidian right here in the area, Marc Desaulniers. Palo Alto City Council unanimously voted down any support for high-speed rail. Where's that coming from? Why are they suddenly getting cold feet or just turning against the project?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily suddenly, but reasonable people can disagree. There are certainly valid concerns that local communities have about an infrastructure project of this size. But we're committed to working with all of them and ensuring that we mitigate against any of the impacts that the system will have. And as I say, reasonable people can disagree. We're certainly open to other alternatives, but our clear description is that high-speed rail can deliver the transportation capacity that other infrastructure can't provide for us. In fact, to deliver the equivalent transportation capacity that high-speed rail will deliver for California, we'd need to spend 2 to 3 times as much on 4,300 miles of freeways, 115 new airport gates, 4 new runways, which just from an environmental standpoint would be very difficult to do. We're certainly not putting another runway in San Francisco Bay, with none of the associated greenhouse gas reduction from those improvements. So we're looking at spending half as much and getting twice as much in return in terms of air quality improvements and travel capacity.
Okay, so what you're saying is the cost of not doing this is twice the cost of doing it.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll buy that, but apparently not everybody does. We had William Grinley on this program a few months ago. He's an opponent to the high-speed rail project. I suspect that's not news to you. He said things like he thought he could drive from LA to San Francisco for less than the cost of a ticket on this train. Is he right? I didn't get that calculation because it didn't sound right. He thought that the ticket on the train was going to be $108. And if you pay 55 cents a mile, you know, that's what it costs to drive your car, and you're going 400 miles, it sounds to me like that's twice the ticket cost, but he maintained otherwise. Where's he coming from?
I'd point out that there's a very great difference between expense and investment. What we're talking about with a project like high-speed rail is about investment, and all too often we spend too much time focusing on the cost of everything and the value of nothing. In this case, we're talking about value and about the return that we'll get on the investment for California. California has a legacy of investing in projects that sustain us for decades and that have gotten us to the point where we're the 8th largest economy in the world. And Governor Brown, as you point out, has been a long-time advocate. In fact, even since his first term in the 1970s, he's advocated for high-speed rail, and happily we're at a point where we're beginning to bring that forward. But it is about that investment and getting a return that is far greater than looking at the incremental cost of driving. Having said that, gas prices will continue to go up. The impacts of vehicles in California will continue to grow. In fact, greenhouse gas emissions in California are generally created by transportation impacts. Most of the rest of the country, most of the rest of the country, those impacts come generally from power. But in California, it's all about transportation. So whatever we can do to mitigate against that, to reduce that, is a benefit in the long term to California.
Okay, well, so it seems like this is a kind of a no-brainer in terms of the environment. You say it's a no-brainer in terms of the cost. My thought is that people don't like it because they say, look, I'm never going to use it because I'm going to get in my car. 85% of all inner-city travel in this country is by private automobile. People love their cars. Americans love their cars. They love those fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. They just love it. Yeah. Mind you, it strikes me that the younger generation, the millennials, they're not so keen on this and they're more interested in public transportation. Do you see any demographic shifts towards building this kind of infrastructure, something we would have done 150 years ago?
We absolutely do see that. In fact, we have an I Will Ride campaign at hashtag I Will Ride on Twitter, where college kids from all over California are very enthusiastic about having high-speed rail in their future and their children's future, and looking at high-speed rail as the next generation of mobility and transportation in California. And I'd also point out that back in the day, the Golden Gate Bridge was sued over 2,300 times. So an iconic structure like the Golden Gate Bridge had its opponents. No less an icon than Ansel Adams said, if you put a bridge in the mouth of the Golden Gate, you'll forever destroy the view of the Marin Headlands. And now, can any of us imagine the bridge not being there?
Well, all right. And what about the fare box return? What percentage of the cost of actually taking a passenger, say, from LA to San Francisco, do you get back in the ticket price?
Well, we expect to have a significant return because, for the most part, once we're fully operational, the high-speed rail system will be a closed system. So you, like an airline, you have to purchase a ticket to get on the train,
right,
and that's how you get access to the train. Having said that, the High-Speed Rail Authority is charged with the construction of the facility, but the actual operation and ongoing maintenance of the facility will be a concession. And that's where private industry has an opportunity to participate in the development of the project and ultimate operation of the project. The authority's policy has been that the cost of a ticket on future high-speed rail trains will be roughly 80% of any airline ticket between the same city pair. So if a trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles on Southwest is $100, it'll be roughly $80 on high-speed rail.
Okay, but I'm not sure that everybody recognizes that transportation in this country has always been subsidized, and they don't think that it's being subsidized. You know, what we spend on highways every year, it's more than $100 billion, right? And they get something like half of that from the gas tax, because the gas tax hasn't been changed. The users aren't paying for it. It's coming out of general funds, right?
That's exactly
And the airlines are also subsidized. So the fact that this will be subsidized you didn't say what percentage is in the fare box revenue. Would it be as much as 70%, 60%?
It should be. Again, in a closed system, you have to have a ticket to get on the train. There should be a fairly even return on that investment.
Okay.
And our CEO, Jeff Morales, has a great analogy about the expectations that were created by passing the bonds for high-speed rail. And he refers to it as having a Christmas morning effect, that we passed the bonds in 2008 in support of high-speed rail on November 4th, and on November 5th we woke up and wanted to see our train. Where's the train? And as you know, any infrastructure of this magnitude takes some time and takes some planning and takes some patience. And happily we've been able to make some progress, and now that we're underway, under construction, we're starting to gain some of that momentum with the advent of cap and trade funds at the state level. The governor and the legislature have invested in the future development of high-speed rail in a meaningful way, and that served as a catalyst for private investment. We've seen many private investors come forward who are interested in participating in the full development of the California project. So it's a very exciting time for the project right now.
A lot of criticism is levied against the fact that the first section of this railroad is going to be built out where there aren't any people. And to me, that just means, look, you got to learn how to do it. I mean, the first sections of the Transcontinental Railroad didn't connect anything of very great interest, moving west from Omaha or whatever. But they learned how to build the railroad. And is there any aspect here of that, or is it just simply that we'll build as many miles of track as we can for as little money?
Well, it's a combination of things, part of which I mentioned earlier, Seth, is that the Central Valley would be the 12th largest state in the Union. There are plenty of people in the Central Valley to be served and that need that kind of mobility. At the same time, it is, from a construction standpoint, a much easier stretch of the project for us to construct in terms of getting rails on the ground much more quickly and making the federal investment of American Recovery Act funds that are a portion of our investment in the Central Valley, part of that, and getting it on the ground sooner and getting that section constructed for much less money than some of the urban areas will require. Certainly much less time, because construction in those urban settings are much more complicated. And finally, that section will serve as the ultimate testing and certification arm of the system, but it's still a very central component, really the backbone of the statewide high-speed rail system.
What are the two cities that I might recognize the names of that'll be connected by high-speed rail?
Merced to Bakersfield, Fresno to Bakersfield. And in fact, if you look at our ridership in our most recent update of our business plan, the 2014 business plan, the travel between those city pairs is increasing exponentially and will tend to be much greater than even the trips between San Francisco and Los Angeles.
What is the expected population of California along this corridor likely to be, say, in 20, 30 years?
Well, we're looking at growing to upwards of 50 million people in California by 2040. We're looking at effectively adding, in that time, the population of the state of New York. So mobility clearly is going to be something we have to address going forward. And many of those folks will be living in the Central Valley and will need that mobility. As it stands right now, 8 of the top 10 most populous cities in California are our station cities. So 8 of our stations are among the most populated cities in California. So we're trying to ensure that we're offering point-to-point travel for those citizens.
Ben, when it's pointed out that, Japan, Europe, even relatively not so well-off countries like Italy have high-speed rail that completely dwarfs anything you can find in the United States, and China is building track as fast as it can, what do you say to these people?
We're doing our best to catch up. You're right that China just finished almost 5,000 miles of rail. They're looking at building another 5,000 miles. They've invested $300 billion in high-speed rail alone as part of a $650 billion investment in transportation infrastructure in China. It has been part of the challenge for the California project and really high-speed rail in the United States that we're trying to develop a cutting-edge 21st century rail system that's 50 years old in the rest of the world, and that we've been playing catch-up.
So why are these people objecting? I mean, why is there this objection? I can understand they can say, we can't afford it. All right, yeah. You can argue that. I can understand that, I just wonder whether there isn't something in the DNA of the American populace that says, train so old school.
Well, I think it's about rediscovering trains, that because we had moved away from them for a time, the car became king, and as we've talked about, regional rail in the Bay Area was the order of the day. The Trans-Bay Terminal in San Francisco served over 24 million people a day, a year, prior to World War II. On rail when the old key system ran on the bottom deck of the Bay Bridge. Well, that was torn up. Many of those rails were taken out. Now we're putting many of those systems back at hundreds of times the cost, sadly. But we had an opportunity to develop that European ethic. The car came to the fore and has been the way that we've been traveling since. But that doesn't prevent us from changing direction and looking at intensifying development in downtowns around station. Using rail is really beginning to be the way that we're moving forward.
Okay, finally, Ben, and rather briefly, is California, I mean, I don't see high-speed rail anywhere else. Northeast Corridor is not really high-speed. California going to be the first one? Are we going to lead the rest of the nation in this?
Well, it's important to remember that California has always been a leader, that we've always led the way nationally and internationally on projects like the UC system, the CSU system. We built the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge during the deepest, darkest depression in our history and have led the way on initiatives like that nationally. So we expect high-speed rail to do just that once again.
Ben Tripousis, thank you so very much for being with us. Thanks also to our expert KMVT staff and our hardworking producer, Susan Hubbard. I'm Seth Shostak, inviting you to join us next month for Silicon Valley Buzz. Good night.